Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. On today's show, I am joined by an old friend of mine from China, Mark Greevan. Mark is a Chinese-speaking Dutch professor of innovation and strategy at the Institute of Management Development in Lausanne, Switzerland. However, Mark does have a long and storied career in China that predates his recent move to Europe. He is also the author of two books, both published by MIT Sloan, the first in 2017 called Business Ecosystems in China, Alibaba and Competing Baidu, Tencent, Xiaomi and LeEco, and his second book, published in 2019, Pioneers, Hidden Champions, Changemakers and Underdogs, Lessons from China's Innovators, as well as several very good articles that I also recommend you go and find and read. Needless to say, we spend a good amount of time asking Mark about his books and explaining what he means using terms like hidden champions as a class of innovators, or what he means by swarm innovation and rapid centralized decision-making when referring to the 6 typical ways Chinese entrepreneurs innovate. We close out the conversation discussing a famous Chinese manufacturing giant who has set the bar for surviving the pandemic, deep diving into how the structure of their organization has allowed them to set the high watermark for enterprise resiliency during these difficult times due to COVID-19. Enjoy.
But when you talk about the underdogs, you talk about easily about 150,000. So it's a very, very large group of very small companies, but all developing a really hardcore technology. So when you ask, what strategies or competitive strategies are they following? Yeah. I mean, obviously for the different groups, they're different, but I think they have one very important thing in common. They're really good at starting from whatever works for the customer.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies.
Mark, my old friend, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me. Really happy to be here.
Now, you and I go quite a ways back to my days in Shanghai when you were in Hangzhou, and you are currently now in Lausanne. This is where we're recording you from. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up in China and what you were doing there.
Yeah, so I, my story started in basically 2004 when I had this idea to do a PhD project on Chinese innovative companies. And I still remember that my dean at that time said, this is probably going to be a really short project. So see you back in 3 weeks. But I said, it's interesting. And I had the opportunity to meet Jack Ma, from Alibaba, fairly early on. So I was like, something is going on here. So that's why actually I moved to Hangzhou, so the city of the West Lake, the mountains, but of course also the city of Alibaba. And that was one of the reasons why I came there, studied, did my PhD project and got back.
What was your first impression of Jack Ma?
My first impression was that he was actually quite modest in dealing with questions. So we had this setting where it was kind of like a family day. And then I had an opportunity to ask a question, even though obviously I'm not a Chinese family member. And he was pretty modest in answering. I was like, wow, Alibaba is so cool and all this amazing stuff you're doing. And he said yeah, but actually we're just doing kind of really small steps. We just do take a lot of steps, but we do this a lot of small steps. And I thought, hey, that's actually interesting. Nothing of the big disruptive blah 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 around it. So it was pretty cool.
You and I go back quite a ways, as I alluded to before. We were introduced by our mutual friend Baz Overtoom back in, I would say, 2013, 2014, somewhere in there. Now, at the time when we used to meet up and bring our entrepreneurs together, you were a professor of entrepreneurship at the University of Hangzhou, Zhejiang University, I believe. And I'm curious to know, now after all this time, now that you're in your new role in Lausanne, Switzerland at IMD, what was it like working for a university in China, and how would you compare it to your new role now?
Right. Yeah. So it's a great question. I mean, at Zhejiang University in Hangzhou, it's a public school, so it's a public university, and I was at the management school of management, it has all the let's say features of a bureaucracy that you could imagine when it comes to state-run public institutions. So obviously also the university has that. I think one of the things that really made a huge impression for me with being at Zhejiang University was, besides the fair amount of limitations in terms of what you can do and cannot do, the students couldn't care less. They were super eager to try out whatever, be really creative, or also really open to figure out stuff. And I thought that was really nice. But obviously I was being a professor there, so you teach courses, you come back every week, doing classes over and over again. And if I look at where I'm now at IMD here in Switzerland, I mean, it's a completely different world. I mean, what we do here is basically, there's no such thing as kind of like a repetitive courses. So most of the work we do is with executive clients, so with custom programs, executive MBA programs. So we get into a business much more than I did at the university in China. And I think another really big difference is that in China, even though it was a globally accredited business school, with all the fancy things, it was still very much a Chinese school with Chinese professors and Chinese students and Chinese companies. And here at IMD, pretty much it's kind of all over the place. I think there's only 2 Swiss or 3 Swiss in the whole faculty here. So wow. That's pretty interesting.
I alluded to the fact that we used to get together and bring our entrepreneurs together, and I would mash my startups together with your entrepreneur students in your school of management. And we used to do some very fun things. We did the Marshmallow Challenge as a great icebreaker. We would then do the startup improv and mix all the teams up and mix all the entrepreneurs up. And we would just have a gas, and they would have to do pitches, and a lot of them were pretty funny. And we just have a really good time. Plus we do some pitching and some tutorials around that. I'm interested to know, because you worked with so many international students studying entrepreneurship in Hangzhou, and they came from all over the place, how would you say they were able to adapt to the environment in China? And in particular, what do you believe the most difficult part was for them?
As you said, they come from all over the place. It was like an entrepreneurship program, and the purpose was really, to help, foster entrepreneurial talent, and actually in the stuff that we did together when your startups came together with my students, it was really also just to get them excited about starting business and so on. And I think a lot of the students that when they came to China, I think they all had this impression like, wow, this is the place where everything is possible. And, like the gold, must lie on the street. We just have to pick it up, like it's going to be easy to do that. And, we as foreign, talented young people, of course, we have huge advantage. But actually that was, I think, one of the biggest mistakes or biases that they had. So in fact, there was very little advantage coming from abroad in this market context, and they figured out that being an entrepreneur in China is really hard work, and of course lots of opportunities, but also lots of challenges. So I think that the local competition and all the local strong companies and entrepreneurs and so on was something that for a lot of them was something to adjust to, at least in the first phase.
I've long held the opinion that it is very hard to start up in a country that you weren't born and raised in, or at least very familiar with, because you lose the advantage of the intrinsic understanding of how things work, how people think, generalized tastes and preferences amongst consumers. You've made something that's already very, very hard just that much harder.
But that's a good point, actually, because in the end, whatever you do as an entrepreneur, you need to build something that people want to buy, and I think for a lot of the students in the beginning, it was really hard, to get to, how do I actually know what the Chinese customer, what they want, and that's much more complicated, as you said, outside of your own comfort zone, but also in an environment where like China is a really interesting place. It's super dynamic and moving, and everything's moving around. It's also very digital. So the Chinese people are so used to using all kinds of digital technologies. So if you want to get to know them, you need to get to know all of these different ecosystems of platforms and tools, and that's not easy, I think.
Your book, Pioneers, Hidden Champions, Changemakers, and Underdogs, is all about learning from China's innovators. Can you break down those 4 categories for us?
Yeah. So what we did with this research project, basically, it took us 10 years to build this project.
Wow.
What we did is we figured, we started actually with the big companies, like let's say the Alibabas, the Haiers and Huawei's of China, which we now call in the book, we call them the pioneers, like for kind of first generation, really successful, innovative companies. But while we were doing this research, we kept running into new companies. And another company we never heard of, and another company we never heard of. And we figured out, hey, these companies are also doing really cool stuff, but they seem to be different than these pioneers. So then in the end, we sort of collected all of this stuff and all the interviews we did, and we saw there's sort of kind of 4 types. So the first type being these pioneers, which are kind of the established incumbent organizations that were maybe sometimes started already in the 1980s, in the case of manufacturing business, or in the early 2000s, in the case of internet business. But really the first wave. And then we saw this second group, which we call, in a book, we call Hidden Champions. These are companies they're really fascinating. They were in all kinds of places where you would not even know where to go, outside of the big cities, outside of Beijing and Shanghai. And they would be very, very good at a very specific technology or application or industrial product that as a consumer you would never meet. But in the business to business, let's say the value chains, would actually do really good. And these companies, these hidden champions, are typically top 3 worldwide in terms of turnover. Really big players, but in a very small niche. But you never heard of them, and they're hidden. They're hidden because also they kind of want to stay hidden. They're kind of like don't talk about me. Let me do my thing. And that's good enough because within my small niche, everybody knows we're good, so that's fine. So let's forget about all the fuss. And so that was the first group, the hidden champions that we discovered after the pioneers. I think the second and the third group are younger. So companies like the third group, we call them the technology underdogs. So these are mostly companies founded by overseas returnees, so people with really good degrees, PhDs, engineering, science from abroad, usually UK, US, maybe Japan, and they start their businesses in China, and usually very much technology driven, so science and technology driven, but younger, maybe 10 years old or so. And then we have what we call the Changemakers. So as a fourth group, in short, these are just digital-driven ventures, digital-driven unicorns. So companies that, in terms of specific domain knowledge, it's interesting, but it's mostly interesting business models, disruptive new ideas for traditional industries, which is driven completely by digital technology. Get lots of users, burn a lot of venture capital money, grow very quick, and then hope that you find a way to make money out of it. And it's an interesting group because they push traditional businesses and incumbent industries to rethink the way they make money.
You know what? That's really interesting. I think you make some very astute observations in there. What kinds of technologies do these people or companies develop? What are their competitive strategies, and what are their key drivers of innovation?
Yeah. So in terms of technologies, we see them, let's say the pioneers and the underdogs and the hidden champions, they're pretty much in almost every industrial vertical that you can imagine, really from specialty chemicals to electronics to software and artificial intelligence. So but really deep in the technology side, very much R&D driven. And then when you go to the Changemakers, you'll find them basically in any type of retail, consumer oriented business. So if you look at these, pretty much if you look at all of them, they cover a lot of manufacturing and service industries and businesses all over the place, which actually makes them scary because if you think about them, the big pioneers, maybe there's like 30 to 40 big companies like Haier and Huawei, 30 to 40 different companies. When you think about the hidden champions, you talk about maybe 200 in the whole of China. But when you talk about the underdogs, you talk about easily about 150,000. So it's a very, very large group of very small companies, but all developing a really hardcore technology. So when you ask, what strategies or competitive strategies are they following? Yeah. I mean, obviously for the different groups, they're different, but I think they have one very important thing in common. They're really good at starting from whatever works for the customer. It's extremely customer driven, customer and market first, and then figuring out how to build the technology or how to make it a sustainable long-term advantage. I would actually say many of them are not even looking for sustainable advantages. They're looking for transient, temporary advantages that work now, and perhaps if they don't work tomorrow, we find something else.
Yes, they have gone from risk averse to risk tolerant in a very short span of time, that's for sure. You identify 6 typical ways Chinese entrepreneurs innovate, including things like swarm innovation and rapid centralized decision making. First, let us know what all 6 are. Then please give us some greater detail on each.
Yeah, so I mean, one purpose of the project was to understand whom are we dealing with. So hence, the categories of different types of companies. So that was one big purpose. And then we thought, well, it's nice to know whom are we dealing with, but it's nicer to know, how are they doing it? So we want to know the how. So the way of they innovate, the way they compete. So the purpose was really also to figure out, is there something Chinese about the way they innovate and compete? And then we came up with something called the Chinese Innovators Way, which is basically a kind of suggesting, yes, there is. So when we talk about, for instance, swarm innovation, so think about this 150,000 technology underdogs. I mean, a lot of them are not doing unique things. A lot of them are just saying, there is a gap in the market. This company has proven this works. Let's now, with the hundreds of us, do the same thing, but maybe differentiate a little bit. This is what we call swarm innovation, going after the same opportunity collectively, and then by super heavy competition, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 come out. We've seen this with the shared bikes, which in the end became kind of a bit of a fuzz, or with the taxi hailing, or all kinds of businesses. We've seen this happening. So swarm innovation. When we have a couple of other ones, like the centralized decision making. I think in Western companies like Amazon, it would be called single-threaded leadership. So where basically, there's super clear leadership directives to executives and leaders in the company. And they say, you have 1 week to do this one task, and you have so many resources. So, very specific on what it is. And Chinese companies are really good at that. And then, it's getting really to get execution, get everything done as quick as possible. So this is another one of those different ways. If I would need to choose another one, which I think is particular or interesting, is Chinese companies are really good at tinkering. They're really good at figuring things out on the way, kind of glorified experimentation with a kind of an effectual learning loop in it. I think it's something they're pretty good at. So these are a couple of those, I would say, ways that Chinese companies innovate, and probably none of them are unique as such independently. But put all of them together, I think they give kind of a feeling of like, hey, this is something that collectively combined, not a lot of other companies in the world do like this.
I believe it was Reid Hoffman who said, being an entrepreneur and building a startup is like putting the parts to a plane in a backpack, jumping off a cliff, and figuring out how to build the plane on the way down. Now, I personally witnessed a massive shift in the ability of Chinese individuals to be innovative and risk tolerant after about 2010, meaning that the change was likely underway at least a few years before that. Now, 5 years ago or so, there was an article that came out that said Peking University has surpassed MIT as the #1 engineering school in the world. And I brought this up to a technically elite friend of mine in Beijing who attended Peking University, and he opined that they did produce the greatest quantity of the greatest quality of engineers that knew how to use technology created by MIT grads, inferring that their ingenuity and creativeness was lacking. Would you agree with that opinion at any point? And if not, was it ever the case, and when did it change?
Yeah, so I think the thing with China is that everything is always moving, So if you say 2015, for me that's like two eons ago.
Decades,
right? It's like crazy long time ago. So things are always moving. So I think that we've seen kind of different waves of when it comes to creativity and innovativeness with Chinese companies and Chinese people in general. So first of all, I mean, it's impossible to generalize about sort of creativity of the Chinese entrepreneur or of Chinese engineers as such. I think what we have seen is, if you distinguish the group that came back from the US or the UK or from Europe and started businesses, many of those engineers are as creative, innovative, open-minded as you can get.
Sure.
So that's a fairly large group. You talk about 800,000 people per year or so. It's a fairly large group in 2015. And I think what comes out of the Chinese university system today, let's say Peking University or Zhejiang University or Tsinghua, the top schools, I think when it comes to engineering talent, I mean, I think it's absolutely amongst the world top class engineers and scientists. I mean, I think today it is more difficult to get into, for instance, Tsinghua or Peking University than it is to get into MIT and Harvard. I mean, it's very, very competitive. Now, does that mean that everybody at these universities are very creative, necessarily as creative as people in MIT and Stanford? Well, probably not. Because maybe that's not necessarily what the market needs. So I mean, there's always a connection between what the market wants and what everybody's doing, and then what the universities are spawning out. So I think that there's an equal percentage of really creative and intelligent people and innovative and so on. But you would also find people that are just really good at a certain technology, but might not be the ones that come up with the fundamental, the new paradigm shift or so. Although in the last years, in certain areas, that is changing. Areas like software engineering, like artificial intelligence, also in areas like special materials, so material sciences, biotechnology, medical fields, or things like the combination of traditional medicine and Western medicine. I mean, you find in specific areas really breakthrough technologies, like super creative new things coming out of Chinese universities. And so that is changing.
You're right. It all has changed, and potentially bad on me for my own lag in catching up and understanding how innovative they are. I mean, they went through so many cultural shifts and so many ups and downs, the Mao Zedong eras, and then coming out of that and trying to build back up. Safety first was the priority for a lot of the grandparents of our now young generation of innovators in China. So potentially I'm a little bit behind the times, and that is a question better suited 4 or 5 years ago.
No. I mean, I think it's still a valid question, because this is something that also a lot of people have in mind, right? I mean, the reality is not everybody that goes to Peking University is going to be a creative genius. I mean, in fact, a lot of the companies that we've worked with are not necessarily, as well educated university graduates. A lot of them, really innovative companies are founded by people that have no particularly, visible elite education. So I think we find the creativity in all kinds of corners, not necessarily only in the top schools.
Yeah, you're right. When you're allowed to fail and you almost can get comfortable with failing, then amazing things can happen. Can you give us some examples of emerging innovators like Royole and discuss why they pose real threats to incumbents, especially Western incumbents, often in those unexpected places or industries?
Yeah. So I think, again, if you would distinguish the different players, you get the different answer. But, if we look at companies like Royole, the companies like Hikvision, they do smart security cameras, or Lens Technology, they make glass for touchscreen applications. They have like a 50% global market share on touchscreen glass.
Wow.
Those companies are, it's a bit like, they're there. We would not really notice them because they're not in the news, but they play a very crucial role in this global value chain. So basically, if a company like Hikvision or Lens Technology, if they would sort of suddenly drop out, then we would not have phones to buy. Yeah. So they play a very important role there, and I think already for a longer time. And I think a lot of companies don't realize that their dependency in the value chain is already much deeper into Chinese and Chinese innovators than perhaps what was thought. Now, companies like Royole, or another company we really like is a Malong Technology. They do artificial intelligence for retail applications. So they do have a very nice image recognition technology that you can use on fibers, like on cloth. Mm-hmm. You can actually use in e-commerce applications, to say this is what type of cloth exactly, the percentage of wool and all this kind of thing. So pretty cool. From Shenzhen, a company in the south of China. These companies are not necessarily a threat directly to large incumbents, like the big companies from the US and Europe. But they could sort of come at the back in the value chain, start to play a role, and then slowly kind of move up and become, crucial technology providers, and then kind of become like hidden champions. So if you look at these 200 hidden champions today, without which a lot of global value chains would not be able to exist in terms of building technology solutions. Now then you have these 150,000 small companies that are slowly moving up to become hidden champions. So I think that's the real, let's say, the threat. Mm-hmm. At the same time, it's also the opportunity, right? Because if you are a clever executive in a big company, you say, those are the companies that you would like to work with, to invest with, to partner with, or even to buy. And that's exactly what a lot of the large pioneering Chinese innovators like Huawei and Alibaba and so on are doing. So there's kind of an overlap between those groups.
In your article titled How Autonomy Creates Resilience in the Face of Crisis, published by MIT Sloan, who has also published your other works, thank you to them, you write about one Chinese manufacturing giant that quickly rebounded from the COVID-19 pandemic, largely due to its org structure. So given COVID-19 has exposed the fragility of global supply chains due to dependencies that span vast geographic distances, what can we learn from companies like Haier who do things a little differently, affording them the resiliency so many other companies would love to have right now?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that organizational design is kind of boring, right? I mean, if you look at what business school teach about it, the matrix structure and business units and all this kind of stuff.
It wasn't my favorite course in business school for sure. I'll give you that.
No. So the thing is that what Haier kind of shows, so this is the Chinese white goods manufacturer, actually the largest in the world. They acquired GE Appliance and so on. They do really well. What they made us rethink what is the purpose and of organizational design and why it matters. Because basically what they're doing and what they're trying, so they would never admit themselves that they succeeded. This is a feature of the company, and they say there's no such thing as an established enterprise. Even we're number one in the world, we're not established. We're not successful. So and what they do is they have been experimenting with how can we give our frontline employees and workers as much autonomy as possible to respond quickly to the market. So they have been experimenting since the 90s, and they said, maybe we should get rid of middle management, and they did. Maybe we should get rid of all the resource functions in between, accounting and HR and all these things. Let's get rid of all the up and down reporting as much as we can, and we try to build it as kind of a platform of small companies. Now, during the crisis, this turned out to be really powerful for two reasons. Because on the one hand, if you have more autonomy at the frontline teams, the people and the teams that really work with the customers, with the factories, making the products and delivering them, if you give them autonomy, they can decide that for their particular product or for their particular part of the production, we now quickly need this piece or that component. Let's go to this partner locally, source it there next week, and we have it. Without going all up the chain, go to corporate headquarters, can we get approval, blah, blah, blah. So what it actually did is that all these frontline small businesses, they had enough autonomy to make quick decisions on, for instance, sourcing their products and raw materials to be able to build the products they want to build. So actually in this crisis, it kind of shows that, having the autonomy, giving that kind of autonomy away to the local frontline kind of teams, this actually helps you to deal with this kind of crisis much more responsively. Obviously, it also allows these frontline employees to work and find new growth opportunities quicker. because they're on the front line and they can make the decision. They can say, let's spend this money on doing a little bit R&D, or let's partner with that company. So I think that shows in this kind of really turbulent times that there's an advantage of, sort of tuning down the organizational structure to the bare minimum. So there's still kind of a synergy of the brand and everything, but having autonomously functioning units and teams doing what they do best at the front line.
Usually I end the show by asking our guests for their best piece of advice to brands who want to enter China. But today I think I'm going to switch it up based on what you were just talking about. What is your best piece of advice to companies who need to change their organization, their supply chain, their strategies, their customer segments, etc.? What would you suggest that they do to not only survive the pandemic, but to gain some resiliency, gain some capacity to be successful coming out of the pandemic, which we all hope happens sooner than later?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. I think building resilience, just like in the example of Hire, I think that's fantastic. But I think what's even better is if we're not only resilient, which means coming back to how it was before and maintaining that situation, but actually be able to thrive. So get better out of this crisis. And I think that the one thing that I would recommend also our listeners, I think, really start thinking in terms of ecosystems. Stop thinking in doing things yourself alone. This is the moment really to leverage all these partners and suppliers and customers and whatever is out there to figure out how together you can be more quick and more relevant in the market, especially now when the market is so uncertain and so dynamic. And I think there's a real opportunity now to not necessarily reorganize yourself, because that's a very painful process. But to start to say, like, how can we get all of the resources out there, mobilize them, and make the phone calls to those partners, on Monday morning. Tell them, we're open for business. Tell them the stuff. Wait, this is the stuff we have. What do you have? Let's figure out what can we do together. Yeah. And I think that's really my biggest piece of advice now. Build an ecosystem advantage, and now is the best time to do that.
Mark, my old friend, thank you for coming on my show. Thank you for being such a brilliant guest. I so hope that you enjoy your time now in Lausanne, Switzerland, or at least half the time that you do get to spend there. And I do wish you the best and wish you all the safety and health and happiness for you and all your loved ones. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for having me, and keep in touch with everyone.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands, just like yours, enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co. And be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Zaijian.